Okay, so welcome to today's session on emotion-based school avoidance. My name's Linda Brindle. I'm a senior psychotherapist in the psychology and schools team, and I've got my colleague with me here today.
Hello, my name's Hope Westgate and I'm a clinical psychologist in the psychology and schools team.
So today we're going to be leading through this session to help think about the issues involved with working with students with emotion-based school avoidance. So we'll have a chance to consider a range of strategies that will be helpful for you to use with students you come across with this presentation in school. So just to kick off, it would be really helpful for us to know a bit about who you are. So if you could use slido.com and log in often with a separate device using the code below, and just let us know what's your job role in school so we know who we're speaking to this afternoon. The learning support team, thank you. Okay, support worker, that's really helpful. So actually both going into homes and working within the school with children and young people with learning difficulties. Okay, we've got Senko, mental health lead, safeguarding officer. Thank you. We can see all that range there. Elective home education advisor. Really helpful to see the range of people here today. And from looking at that list, I can see there'll be lots of people who will perhaps be exposed a lot to this area of work. So we hope that you'll be able to use Slido to chip in and share some of your experiences and advice as we go through this presentation today. Okay, young persons worker as well. Lovely. And just secondly, it'd be really helpful for us to get a sense of how you would rate your knowledge of working in this area prior to our session starting. Okay, great. So what I'm seeing is actually there's a good amount of knowledge in the room. You're all rating yourselves as okay or good. We hope that we can add to this afternoon, certainly give you opportunity to think and consider some of the ideas that we're talking about to help you develop those skills even further than you already have. Okay, thank you. So our aim today, as I just said, is to help increase your understanding around emotion-based school avoidance. And so as part of that, we'll be thinking about what factors keep it going. We'll be looking at helping you be aware of what are effective approaches for working with EBSA and how to break that cycle. We'll be thinking about how to teach students helpful, simple coping strategies that can support them on returning to school and that whole development of the plan that's really important to get just right for the individual pupil. And lastly, we'll be thinking about also how we can strengthen pupil resilience to try and avoid this presentation occurring so frequently in schools as well. Okay, so let's just have a little think about what exactly we're talking about. What is emotional-based school avoidance? So often, and definitely in the past, this was always called school refusal, as you'll see in the quote on the slide in front of you. And this is actually still a helpful quote, even though we've changed the language use a bit. So school refusal occurs when stress exceeds with support, when risks are greater than resilience, and when pull factors that promote school non-attendance overcome the push factors that encourage attendance. And today we'll be thinking about what those pull factors are that can pull young people away from school, and how to support those push factors too. I guess just a note on the term school refusal. I think there's been a real move away from that term because that can be felt to be unhelpful, almost sort of blaming the problem to be with the pupil, rather than recognizing that actually maybe this is something outside of their control, and the pupil, because of the levels of sort of emotion involved and anxiety around school and attendance, may not have full control over why they're not able to attend. So this group that we're talking about is really distinct from those pupils who just choose to truant because they don't want to be in school. These are the group we're talking about today, young people whose prolonged absences are due to a specific emotional distress that they experience around attending school. So I just wanted to be really clear about what exactly we're talking about today. Okay, let's have a think about what causes emotion-based school avoidance. And I hope you can see clearly on your screen, there's loads of words up there. We've got 3 columns to help us to think about what factors are associated with vulnerability in this area. Have a glance at the chart. You'll see there's 3 columns of school factors. I'm sure many of those will look familiar to you. Non-attendance may be to avoid situations that might be stressful due to academic demands, whether pupils are struggling with a particular subject or a teacher or exams, or often we also see due to social pressures with relationship issues and bullying and social anxiety. But equally, that there might be things that we can become less aware of, even if we're in school, around issues around transport or the journey to school. There's a range of family factors you can see listed. Separation anxiety is often common, especially with younger pupils. And of course, when younger pupils stay at home, they're feeling very comfortable, and it's only when they're leaving the home that they're not comfortable. But there may also be losses in the home. It may be that parents have had difficult experiences of school life themselves. And so actually a bit of a history of non-school attendance or a narrative about problems with school can also feed messages that maybe school doesn't feel a safe place. And that can clearly be an important factor in influencing a child from choosing to attend. And of course, there's the pupil factors as well, the factors in the child. So have a look down that list. I guess what's important to point out is that, as well as some of the more obvious ones, things like fear of failure and poor self-confidence are significant factors that can lead to avoidance of school, and therefore opportunities for staff to build up self-esteem and coping strategies are always really key, and we'll be thinking a bit more about those things later. And of course, it needs to be noted that we still know that learning difficulties or disability can be undiagnosed for some time, unidentified, and therefore not supported. And likewise, many of the children that we may come across, Hope and I in our line of work, have experienced trauma in their lives. But for most school staff, they won't necessarily know anything about that. So that's really tricky, isn't it? Because you may not know about trauma experiences, and quite understandably, young people don't necessarily want to share them, but that can have an impact on attendance too. We know that trauma memories can get triggered in certain environments, whether it's the sounds or smells or situations that are faced in school. So sometimes that will be a factor that will also play into this whole area of EBSA. And what I've talked about here, these are all the factors that have always been around, even prior to the pandemic. And we know that since the pandemic, there's been additional challenges for young people, especially those who are already struggling in school, with the changes in rules, additional lockdowns and gaps away from school that we know are always hard for this population, who find that returning to school when it feels hard, even harder. And I guess there's sort of mixed messages over what feels safe to do and not safe to do, all adds into this really complex presentation that we often see for young people. So I guess this slide is really important, because it helps us to not just assume that maybe there's one reason for what's going on. There's often multiple things going on which contribute and interlink to the presentation. And we do know that since COVID, there's been an increase in the number of children who've been struggling to attend school. So hopefully holding on to this sort of table will be really useful for you when you're trying to understand what's going on for young people. Okay, and if we move on then, this is a reminder, and I think something, given your areas of work, that you'll all be familiar with this analogy, where we only see the tip of the iceberg when we see what's going on with a child and their behaviour, but what we know is underneath is really the explanation of what's going on. So holding on to that visual image that the behaviour we're seeing is actually triggered by all sorts of thoughts and feelings, past experiences, beliefs that we, when we're in school as staff members, may just not be aware of. It's important to note, because we can go towards making assumptions that aren't actually right. They might not be quite spot on. We might sometimes totally miss the mark in understanding what's going on for a young person. So I guess this slide is really about encouraging you in your roles to always be curious, quickly curious, to try and work out what's going on when you're spotting a young person is starting to show signs of non-attendance and there is less engagement in the school environment. Think about who's the key person for that young person who can start early on to explore those issues. Now, we know that anxiety is very common for emotion-based school avoidance, and I guess it's important to understand really where it's stemming from, and we've talked about a range of different factors that might help us understand that. Let's look now at the interaction between school avoidance and anxiety in the next slide. So this slide shows how anxiety and school avoidance interact and can be self-perpetuating. And I guess this is really key, because this helps to, again, highlight the complexity. I don't want to spend ages to say how complex this is without us sort of really recognising that understanding that will help us with doing the work and planning the best way forward for the young person. So just briefly, if you look at the outer circle, the outer ring here, that shows how anxiety might lead to school avoidance. So uncomfortable feelings and thoughts, which may include physical symptoms of anxiety, can lead to avoidance. And when a young person discovers that those symptoms of anxiety start to reduce when they avoid, that will encourage increased school avoidance. And so the cycle begins. I guess the inner circle here on the slide shows how there are secondary effects that are important to consider with school avoidance. So once a young person starts to increase their school avoidance, once they start staying at home a little bit more, they may actually, of course, discover that it can feel a bit easier being at home because they're not having so much anxiety. But then when they do go back into school, they discover that they're not so engaged with school because they might be falling behind with their schoolwork, or they might struggle around their friendship groups because they've lost sort of touch and they're not quite on it with everything that's being discussed because they've missed some time away. And then these things can create additional anxiety around school, both in terms of academic work or socializing. And that can again feed the increase in more pleasurable activities that they'll find they'll have at home. And this in turn then leads to a decrease in motivation to be in school in the first place. And so I guess this slide is also helping us to see the sort of complex nature of things. And I guess if we were thinking about what might be secondary benefits that are also going on for a child who perhaps is not attending school, perhaps because they're worrying about an unwell parent at home, that might be a very natural response to want to be nearer that unwell parent. And the secondary benefits for the parents could be perhaps as a partner who's busy trying to do everything with the unwell parent at home, and having the child at home helping out, looking after the unwell parent will be a great relief for that partner. And then for the individual that's unwell, having a child caring and being around, feeling cared for and company feel a wonderful feeling. So you can see how there's a lot of things that can feed into a child choosing to be at home, wanting to be at home, ending up at home. And so I guess that's, again, just an example of thinking of the multiple factors that can be involved in pulling pupils away from school for emotional reasons. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. I wonder what you find in your experience you see in the classroom when students are anxious. Okay, aggression, yeah. Tapping, fidgeting, non-engagement, withdrawn, or challenging, yeah. So I think you're really clearly already highlighting the very different presentations that we see with young people who are anxious. So some will internalize, withdraw, feel numb, disengage. Others will externalize. They might be panicky, they might seem overwhelmed, struggle to focus or concentrate, yeah. Report physical sensations of anxiety, yeah. So a real mixture, no eye contact, yeah, a lot of you are noticing that as well. And those can often be the early signs that there's something more going on for those young people, which is really helpful for us to spot. And I guess when we're spotting these different behaviours that might be signs that are telling us that our student in class is particularly struggling, it's really helpful for us to keep in mind a cycle of arousal that goes on when we experience anxiety. Let's look at the next slide to help us think about that. So this slide shows the escalation of arousal in response to some emotions. So it could be arousal that could be a response to anger or anxiety. And as I think the first person that popped something down on the last Slido said, anxiety can sometimes present as aggression as well. And those things can come together, and especially common with teenagers, actually. And so if we look at this slide, what you can see is that the red line going up shows arousal. So it's looking at a trigger, and as the person becomes more aroused, the escalation leads to that line going higher up, reaches crisis level. There's a bit of up and down there, and then comes back down gradually in a time of recovery and post-crisis. Okay, so the red line is showing arousal levels. The blue line is looking at a person's ability to think clearly. And so the red bell-shaped curve actually inversely corresponds, as you'll see, to access to logical thinking. So when arousal goes up, the quality of judgment drops and the ability to communicate and reason drops with it. Okay, so we know that for young people who are struggling around school attendance, there might often be high arousal going on in the morning with hostile behaviours and aggression, as was talked about. It's really common in home environments when students are feeling the pressure they feel to go into school, which may for them feel like a threatening environment, a threatening situation. So it's really helpful to hold in mind this slide, I think, when working with young people in this area, just being mindful of this sort of connection between arousal levels and ability to think. And that can actually help guide what we do and when we do it, so that we can access and support young people appropriately at the right time for them. Okay. Just have a look at these pictures. I'm wondering what you're thinking. I'm sorry we're not all in the room to have this conversation when you see this. Are you imagining this is the students, or are you imagining this is you, the staff? We know that working in this area is really tough for staff. And that pattern of emotional arousal that we just talked about happens to us all. And I guess this slide is just a reminder for us all to be aware of our own feelings and arousal levels, because that's so important when we're trying to support young people. Staff often report that working with anxious young people who are avoiding school can leave them with all sorts of feelings of frustration, exasperation, feeling stuck and hopeless, and feeling not very sure that things will ever improve. And I guess it's really important as you start a new academic year and everything that will involve to think about how you can be kind to yourself and support yourself and set systems up in place for you as you move through this year, so that you have the time and space to process difficult things and emotions, and you have ways of getting the support that you need around the difficult emotional stuff that you'll be experiencing when you're working with children with high levels of need and challenges. So when we're working, we need to be aware of ourselves and our own emotions first. And once we know that we can be in an okay place ourselves, then we'll be in a ready point to support the young people. And I've just got a couple of slides before we move on to some more specific strategies, just to help us think about how best to do that supporting of young people. So this first slide is around Kim Golding's work, the two-handed approach, and called Connect and Correct. And she says that what's really important is that what we need to do first is make sure that we connect with and understand a student before we can support them to make change, to challenge their avoidance, to address things that need correcting, whatever that looks like. So naturally, there will be a strong instinct, both from school staff and very often from parents, to push hard to get children back into school. But very often this just doesn't work. And what we know is more helpful is a getting alongside approach to a young person to help address their behaviour, and by first supporting a young person to connect and understand what's going on with them, then we can more effectively help support them to manage their anxious thoughts and intense feelings. And from doing that, that will be the best starting point from bringing around change. So connect to and understand the person first, and then support the change happening afterwards. So anxious feelings are really hard to tolerate, and it's not surprising that that with the short-term relief of avoidance being so powerful, young people aren't easily going to choose to do something different. So what they need to do is develop trust and confidence in us who are working with them. And we know that's the best way to bring about change. So what does connecting look like? I guess it's sort of sitting with, being with, providing a safe place, being transparent about what you're doing, active listening, being available, trying to understand. But I'd say listening is the key, really trying to hear what's going on for the young person. But what about assurance? Is that helpful? Well, we all like reassurance sometimes, don't we? We all need it. It's all good. It can feel good and warm and comforting to have some reassurance some of the time. It can help us to feel held, and it can help our emotions to feel contained. But sometimes we can find that, and I'm sure you'll all register this, that some pupils are constantly coming for reassurance all the time. And whilst they're coming and we try and reassure them, it doesn't actually change anything. It doesn't seem to reduce that pupil's anxiety or change their behaviour. And this tells us that that young person hasn't learned to reassure themselves, and instead they're very dependent on others. And we know then that reassurance isn't actually useful. And in that situation, we need to look at ways to try and support young people to reassure themselves. So we want them to learn that they can depend on themselves rather than always needing to turn to others. So depending on themselves means they can feel confident in themselves, that they can cope. So that's what they need opportunities to do. So how do we do that? Well, I normally say, if you find that you're always repeatedly saying the same thing to a young person, then instead of repeating that next time they ask you that question, will I be all right? Instead of just repeating the same thing you always do, just say to them, what do I always say? And that will give them a chance. It can be something that you say with a smile, a chance to have a go at actually verbalizing what they're used to you hearing. And that's the first step for them internalizing those helpful coping statements that they can say to themselves. So you can gradually support over time a student how to learn to soothe themselves. And your role as staff can be to gradually pull back as they're able to do it increasingly independently without your support. Okay, now I'm going to pass over to Hope, who's going to talk a little bit more about some very specific practical strategies to think about.
Thanks, Linda. So essentially what we want to get to with young people who have not been able to get into school is to be able to start to develop a gradual plan to reintegrate them back into school and potentially for them being back at school full time. So that's really what we want to get to. But before that can all happen and take place and work successfully, we also need to make sure that there's those other things in place to help that be successful. And that includes making sure that we have addressed or are addressing the issues that are causing or feeding the school avoidance. So Linda has talked through lots of those factors that could be impacting on school avoidance. So have we been able to explore with the young person what those are for them and think about how to help some of those or remove those barriers? We also need to think about preparing the student to face their fears by teaching them ways to cope with anxiety. So when we're reintegrating them back, that's going to be a really anxiety-provoking process. And that's unlikely to be completely successful if that child still doesn't really know how to manage their anxiety. And it may be really overwhelming. So we want to help them feel that they are prepared enough and they've got some skills that they can be using when facing that anxiety. And I'll go through in a moment more of what some of those skills could involve. And the other thing is just being mindful of sharing strategies with everyone around that child, really. So anyone that's involved with that child that may be seeing the child at school or before school, including everyone as much as we can and being consistent. So that's going to be most helpful for the young person. So what I'm going to do now is just talk through some things that can be helpful to think about when supporting a young person with anxiety, and we're thinking specifically about emotion-based school avoidance and preparing them to face that anxiety. But actually the skills I'll go through now can be useful for kind of general anxiety, and if you've been to one of our anxiety workshops, some of these may be familiar with you. So I'm just going to give a bit of a helicopter view of some of those anxiety strategies you can use. But essentially it is about working with that child and understanding what is most helpful for them. And sometimes it's good to give them a few skills which they can pick from. So one of the first things that we often will talk about is helping people understand actually what anxiety is and making those links between anxiety and the physical symptoms that often show up. So we often are aware ourselves that anxiety can come in lots of different forms and it can really impact the body. So you can see in that diagram on the right, there's loads of different symptoms of anxiety that we may get, and physical way it impacts us. So things like tense shoulders, our heart beating a lot faster, our breathing rate becoming a lot faster. It may be that we talk about butterflies in our stomach or stomach upset. Vision even getting blurry, feeling quite faint. So there's lots of different things that can happen. And actually when those do happen, they're quite alarming if we don't realise that they're anxiety. And with school-based avoidance, sometimes Children will actually say they can't go to school because they're really ill, because they're feeling sick, and they're quite worried about those symptoms, which is completely understandable because it's hard to work out sometimes what is anxiety and what's maybe an illness. So really helping the child to understand what is anxiety, how does it impact my body, and what kind of symptoms are coming up for me. And if they can understand that link, then actually those symptoms become less alarming, and that can reduce anxiety in itself. And also just understanding that those symptoms, when they are linked to anxiety, aren't necessarily dangerous, and that they will pass, but they're just the body's way of kind of showing up that anxiety. It's really useful to go over some of this information with children if they're not already aware. There's often lots of advice and guidance around helping young people manage anxiety and adults with breathing techniques. So just briefly to say a little bit about breathing techniques and their rationale is that when we're feeling anxious, as I've just said, sometimes it affects our body and it can often affect our breathing rate, becoming shallower and faster. And when our breathing rate changes in this way, often it leads to an imbalance in the amount of oxygen and carbon dioxide that we have. So we're actually starting to overbreathe, and for some people hyperventilating. And when that happens, that leads to those kind of physically unpleasant symptoms, maybe feeling lightheaded, feeling dizzy, and can actually keep that anxiety going a little bit longer. So the reason that breathing is often mentioned is because if we can slow down the breathing rate, then actually we're helping that oxygen and carbon dioxide become more balanced, and we're helping calm down and relax the body. So when we're feeling anxious, there'll be lots of adrenaline going around, and actually slowing down our breathing can help reduce the effect of the adrenaline, and it can help reduce our heart rate. So this is why breathing can be so helpful, and it's really simple as well. So the main kind of ingredients really to any breathing exercises are trying to slow it down in some way, at a comfortable level but slowed, and also making sure people are breathing in properly and kind of deeply enough so it's not too shallow. So the slide here talks about box breathing, which you may have heard of, and is quite a nice concrete way of explaining a breathing exercise. So as you can see, you can just draw out a box, or you can use a box that you already have, and you can go around the box and use that to guide your breathing. So if you look at the top of the box, it's inhale for 4 seconds, and you can even get children just to put their finger along the box as they do this, and they often find that quite helpful. So it guides you to inhale through your nose for 4 seconds, and then as you go down the side of the box, you're holding that breath for 4 seconds, and then going along the bottom, you're exhaling for 4 seconds, and then going up the side, you're holding for 4 seconds. And you can keep going around, and it is useful to kind of go around that at least 3 times, if not more, to really start to get that breathing rate to slow down. And as I said, this is quite a helpful one because you get a visual picture of it as well, which children can use. Another breathing exercise that some people use, and if you're interested in watching Dr. Pookie Knight-Smith present this, then there is a YouTube video on it, 5-finger breathing in 2 minutes. So it's a really quick, simple one. And actually, people find often with younger children, they quite like this, and you can do it with them. So it involves the hand, and it's very similar to box breathing, but using the hand instead. So as we kind of go up our finger here, we're breathing in, we're holding it, and then we're exhaling and breathing out, and then pausing, and then breathing in, holding, exhaling. Again, doing that slowly, so it can be counts of 4, or you can change that counts slightly depending on the person. But again, that's quite practical, and it is helpful to try and do it with young people because it helps model to them, get the pace right. Sometimes they may think they're breathing in and out for 4 seconds, but actually they're doing it a bit quicker. But it can also just help you become quite attuned to them, and they feel like you're in it with them. So that can be really useful. So do have a look at some of these YouTube videos if you can. Now, I just wanted to mention a little bit about self-talk and how this can be helpful when we're feeling anxious. So often when people are feeling very anxious, they'll have lots of negative thoughts going around in their head and doing lots of negative self-talk. So we can sometimes criticize ourselves. With anxiety, we'll often be making lots of negative predictions inside our heads. So thinking something's going to go wrong, or if I go to school, then I'm not going to have any friends, or no one's going to talk to me. So there's lots of negative things that may be going on. And when we're anxious, we're much more likely to pay attention to all of those negative thoughts and self-talk and not notice or not have many at all of positive thoughts or self-talk. So one thing that we can do is try and help young people come up with some more positive self-talk so they can use this before approaching an anxiety-provoking situation and possibly during as well. So in its simplest form, this is simply just helping children to come up with some statements, some positive statements about how they can cope in the situation. So you can see on that picture, it can be really short and simple. I can do it. I'll keep trying. I'll do great, or I've coped with this before, and that's often quite a good one. So helping them think about a time where they've either approached going into school when they thought it was going to be difficult, or just a time that they've coped with something that created a lot of anxiety, and there will be something you can find. So really connecting their statements with memories, perhaps positive memories. And it is important that these statements mean something to them. So we're not just giving them statements that they have to use. It's really important that they come up with some of these themselves. So getting them to think about, what do you think you could say to yourself, which would be helpful in that moment where you're feeling really, really anxious? And short and simple is quite good and easy to remember. It also may be helpful to think about writing them down for that student so that they can have them, or even have some kind of picture that represents it. And as I said, it may be using it beforehand as well as during. So we need to come up with lots of these to counteract those negative thoughts that we're naturally going to have when we're feeling anxious. Okay, so hopefully if this works, I'll try and play a YouTube video. If not, I'll talk through it. But something that's commonly being used is called this 5-4-3-2-1 grounding technique. And essentially, it's about helping people connect to the present moment, giving them something that's a bit more neutral to focus on. And this can be helpful when we are feeling completely overwhelmed by anxiety. So have a watch of this, and this is something that you can share with young people. Okay, so that is the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 grounding technique, and it can be used in lots of different ways. One of the positive things about this as well is people can do it in lots of different settings, and it doesn't always have to be obvious as well. So they can, a child could use it in school, for example, without people necessarily having to know. And something to bear in mind with all of these strategies that I've been talking about with anxiety is it's really helpful to make sure that young people have a sense of how to do this and practice using it even before they need it. So if we were to just use all of these things at the time that we're feeling really anxious, so we're getting a child to go to school, that's causing a lot of anxiety, and we're using these things for the first time, it's probably not going to be ever so helpful because they haven't got used to it, and it's a new thing to try. But if they've already had a sense of it and practiced it and also understood how it works for them, then it is likely to be more helpful. So we just need to think about what they can use beforehand, and practicing that as much as possible. Then it'll be much easier to use when they really do need it.
Oh, can I just say, just before we carry on, that the video didn't play in terms of volume for the 5, 4, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1, I can't even say it, grounding technique, but we will send you a link through as well so you can hear it fully. But the idea is simply think of 5 things you can see in the moment in the room, 4 things that you can hear, 3 things that you can smell, 2 things that you can touch, 1 thing you can taste, or it can be in different orders. But the idea is to just help engage a young person disengage from their anxious thoughts and feelings and re-engage in the present moment. And that clip's a really nice way to help talk through with a young person, or just for yourself to feel confident in using this particular exercise. So we will make sure that you get the link through for that so you can appreciate it in full.
Thanks, Linda. Sorry about that. The sound was on mine, so I assumed it was on everyone else's. But yes, absolutely, you can get the link to that YouTube and listen to it as well. So we've had to think about some anxiety make sure is involved in this plan. Letting them to come up with some ideas can be really helpful. Pacing it, so taking steps and just seeing how that goes. So it can be difficult when there's really tight timelines, and it is about finding that right balance in pace. Equally, sometimes people can get frustrated if it feels like it's going too slow. So we need to kind of find a right pace for that person. And then may need to be some flexibility along the way. And that could include flexibility about how they are reintegrated back to school, what lessons they attend, how long they're there. As well as any flexibility that could be possible in the school day. So that may include things like flexibility to take a break if they need it, or exit the class if they need it, or flexibility to see a certain trusted adult. So these are kind of things that we can think about along the way that can be included in their plan. How can we make this and adapt it so it's really specific to this person? And of course, lots of encouragement along the way. Facing your fears in this way is really, really difficult. And there may be sometimes where it doesn't go completely well, or someone starts to feel hopeless. So if everyone involved is doing lots of encouragement and also lots of praise as well, because that child is being really brave by putting this plan together and taking those steps. So just a note on motivation. As I said, we're asking quite a lot of people when we're asking them to face their fears, or getting them to go back to school, which they were quite scared about. So there really needs to be some element of motivation from them to be able to do this. And when we think about motivation, that can come from various avenues. So we talk about kind of intrinsic or internal motivation, and then some external motivators. So in terms of that intrinsic motivation, that's that motivation that comes from ourselves. So we're thinking about the motivation that comes from inside the young person. What is it that makes them want to get back to school? How does it connect with any of their values or what's meaningful in their life? And they may not automatically know this, and we may need to explore or help them think about this. So for some young people, it may be that they're motivated just because actually they do really, value education, or they're a really hard worker, and they want to work hard, or they want to achieve. That's really important for them. For other young people, it may be more about they're motivated to kind of have a sense of belonging or feel part of a school community, to be with their friends, and join in activities at school. It may be that motivation comes from just wanting to challenge themselves and do things that make them anxious. So really trying to work out what's important to them and how going back to school may be fitting in with some of that. So help them understand any of those intrinsic motivations. But also it's helpful to think about any external motivators and what can help people have that motivation. So it may be just kind of getting lots of praise or some rewards for the steps that they're taking for those brave behaviours. It may be thinking about things that they can do kind of each week to kind of treat themselves or have special time at home. Sometimes young people will just say, I'd like to choose the family film that we watch on Netflix at the weekend as my reward. So it can really be lots of different things, but we want to be thinking in a broad way, what are all the different motivations, both intrinsic and extrinsic, for this young person that can help them make those positive steps towards integration. So I've already mentioned Dr. Pookie Knight-Smith, and she does a lot on emotion-based school avoidance, and has some really helpful tips for professionals and school staff. So there's some here that we've picked up which are really helpful to share. One of the things she talks about is creating a soft landing when children come into school and really welcoming them. And what she means by this is having someone there that can really acknowledge a person coming and give them that really warm welcome, make them feel like they're really wanted there. And it may be just having a bit of a check-in 5-minute talk, or playing a little game, or something like that, something that as soon as they step into the school grounds makes them feel comfortable, and is a really nice warm environment for them. So you may think about in your own school what that looks like, or how that could work, or who that person usually would be that would first greet someone. Also, just to think about enabling that the young person is ready for learning. So if their anxiety levels are quite high, they may need some time before that they go into that classroom and can do the learning, just to relax or calm down, or use some of those strategies that we've talked about. It can be helpful to think about whether there can be any breaks in the days, or what Pookie refers to as resets. So kind of opportunities to have a bit of a pause, to calm down if needed, if that anxiety level is increasing over the day, whether that's kind of a bit of a safe place that's nominated in the school, or being able to have an exit card, or some way that person can reset themselves a little bit. And linked to this, developing a bit of a signal for when the child is getting overwhelmed. So it may be that they're not, but if their anxiety is really increasing, they're getting overwhelmed and they're not able to really engage in the learning, a clear kind of signal or communication for them, which may be them talking to someone, it may be using a picture, it could be different things. Important just to think about managing break and lunch times, and sometimes with emotion-based school avoidance, there are some worries around social situations, or situations where there's lots of noise, lots of people. Breaks and lunch times are often more unstructured, which can be difficult for some people. So just considering when you're thinking about a reintegration plan of what will break and lunch times look for this person, do they need a safe place or consistent place to go? What can we put in place for them at these times, which we know can be a bit more challenging. Also, just thinking about building routines in, and having a bit of a plan, particularly for a Monday morning. So often after a weekend, it can be more difficult to go back to school, even if someone's already started to reintegrate. So just thinking about in that plan, thinking about a routine that's going to help them, which even starts on Sunday night. So what can we start to do that's going to help calm them down or relax them, or we know that's helpful, so that they can get to school on Monday. So as I said, there's lots more out there from Dr. Pookie Knight-Smith, but that's some of the highlights that we've pulled together, which we think are really helpful to consider. Okay, and we're almost at the end, but just to finally say a bit about those push and pull factors. So whilst doing this reintegration, it's just to re-emphasize, we really need to keep monitoring and checking in on those push and pull factors. So reducing those things which are pulling them away from the school, and increasing those factors which actually push them towards going back. So that may be increasing their chances of achievement at school or feeling successful, increasing their opportunities to see people or build relationships, increasing their time where they're able to have fun or really engage and enjoy an activity, helping them be able to kind of reach any of their goals or aspirations. So all of these things, just kind of continually thinking about how can we keep making sure that there's enough of these factors that are pushing them towards school, and there's more of those than there are factors pulling them away from school. So really importantly, just to check in with you, because I know we've been talking for a little bit, but we always find it helpful to actually find out from you yourselves what you have found has made the biggest difference to helping bring about some positive change with those children that display emotionally based school avoidance. So I'm sure that you all have experienced it before, you've worked with these children, and actually I think you probably have some really good tips or ideas to share with other people, or yeah, just highlighting anything at all that you think has been helpful in your own experience within the school setting that you work in. So this is just an opportunity just to type in any of those, and we'll just briefly share it before summarising, rounding off, and sharing some resources with you. We've got patience, understanding, going at the child's pace. Yeah, so that's that really kind of compassionate attitude of kind of being alongside the young person really and going at their pace. Consistency in school is something that we've also highlighted, so having that shared plan, being consistent, and yeah, having plans and routines without last minute changes and expectations can be important. Like someone said, a genuinely positive relationship, and we know that relationships are so important to children and young people, and then if there are some of those genuine kind of strong positive relationships, that can be so helpful when there's lots of anxiety. Warmth and understanding, again, so that's kind of going back to our relationships that we're having with young people, and kind of not being judgmental, but that support. Safe space to regulate, acknowledging that anxiety is genuine and not dismissing it. Yeah, and that can happen sometimes, and people can get frustrated, but when anxiety is there, it's really difficult for the young person, and it can be helpful for them to see and hear that that's been acknowledged. Meet and greet, and I hear a lot of schools do some really good stuff around meet and greets, and having a person that can see them and do that kind of soft landing that we talked about, really welcoming them in and starting that day off on a really positive note. And yeah, and I've seen that being done really, really well in schools. Great, thank you. We'll move on just because we're coming up to time, and I want to make sure we do share the resources. So I guess just to summarise a little bit of where we've got to and what we want to be thinking about, and I know we've shared lots of information today, but some of the key factors are intervening early, because if we go back to that diagram that Linda showed towards the start, the kind of more that anxiety builds and the more avoidance happens, the more it just kind of snowballs and gets worse and worse. So trying to pick it up as soon as we can and start figuring out what's going on and how we can help is the most effective thing. So really kind of spotting the signs and working on it as early as we can. Also just really thinking about all the things we've talked about in terms of supporting the school environment, thinking about coming up with a plan, making it predictable, making it consistent, and thinking about what schools can do to help with that kind of warm, compassionate environment, to help those supportive relationships, but also think about any adaptations that may be needed to that environment for the young person as well. and also crucially working together. So we've talked about lots of different factors that are involved in emotion-based school avoidance, lots of things to consider, and certain anxiety management strategies and a gradual plan. But to do all of that, we do need consistency, and we do need everyone working around the young person. So that's school staff, and that may be multiple school staff, it may be family, it may be other key agencies, they may have some mental health support as well. So if we're all looking at that plan and supporting it, that is what is really, really helpful. Okay, so we've just got some really brief questions just to kind of understand how helpful this has been, get a little bit of immediate feedback. And then for the last few slides, I'll just take you through some resources on emotion-based school avoidance. So hopefully this has come up on your phones or screens or whatever you're using Slido on, how you'd rate your level of knowledge in this area now. So we've done that at the start. So post talking through all these things, where would you say your knowledge is right now? I'll just leave you a few more moments just in case anyone else hasn't done that yet. That's great. I'm glad it got good. So that's positive. So in terms of the training, again, if you could just rate this just for our feedback, it's really helpful to keep gathering this. And I guess we are mindful that there are different professions here and people with different levels of experience. So I guess it's just us checking in of how that felt for people and how helpful it is. And we're aware that for some people that may have been going over knowledge that they already had, and for some people there may have been a few new bits as well. But thank you, that's really helpful. And this should be the last question that we ask of you, but just any things that you'll take away from the training too, if possible. But based on what we've said today, what will you be thinking about now this new academic year is starting? What are you going to be thinking about using with those students who may be avoiding school for emotional reasons? And that may include things that you're already doing, but after this presentation you're thinking, yes, I need to make sure I keep doing that, or you know, that's a really helpful thing to do, or something completely new that you've thought about after this training. So anything at all that you'll think about and take away that you'll do yourself or potentially share with some other people. Thank you. We've got some coming up there. So grounding techniques. So yeah, that's 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Connection correction, really helpful concept by Kim Golding. The escalation of emotional arousal. Thinking about plan, graded exposure, soft landing. Grounding techniques, yeah, so there's some common themes coming up for people, and as we said, we can share the slides and recordings, so that can act as a bit of a reminder for some of these things. Thank you very much. So I'm just going to move on, although you can still type. I just need to go over the resources because I'm aware that time is coming to an end. So there is actually a lot of information out there on emotion-based school avoidance, and some really helpful workbooks and resources. So this is just a West Sussex resource, which looks more about understanding the problems around emotion-based school avoidance and guidance on working. So we can make sure you get the link for this. There's also toolkits which have been specifically made for education providers. Again, provides lots of really helpful information. So there's this toolkit which is provided by Lincolnshire, which is really helpful for education staff. And then also there's a family action kind of toolkit and worksheet on emotion regulation in the classroom. So that's helping thinking about some of those anxiety-based strategies and general emotion regulation as well, if you'd like more detail on that. And then finally, a few more resources. So we've got a resource there from the Anna Freud Centre, which is aimed at schools and colleges for mental health, which includes anxiety and covers some of the issues that we've talked about before. There's lots of free resources on MindEd as well that may be helpful. We also just wanted to remind you, if you're not already aware, that as Psychology in Schools team, we run monthly workshops which are predominantly aimed at parents on various topics, but one of those topics is anxiety, which we run every month, and then we'll offer some different topics as well every month. So this can be freely accessed through Eventbrite. And there is a link there, and it's simply kind of following the Psychology in Schools team page and signing up for the workshops you want to. As I said, it's free, easy to do, and we do get a lot of helpful feedback from parents on that. And then there's also just other services to consider if you are in Suffolk, so things like the Psychology and Therapeutic Services, and they do also work with emotion-based school avoidance. They have lots of information on their website and may be used for support by professionals in schools. And we also just wanted to raise that there is a professional consultation line for schools, which is run by NSFT Wellbeing Under 18 team. And this can be used if you have kind of got questions around this area, or young people that you're working with, and you want someone to consult with a little bit more. So this is the phone number, and if you just ask for that professional consultation line, then that's that.
One thing, sorry, Hope, that I realised I forgot to put on is there's actually new guidance out from Suffolk County Council about how schools should work with emotion school avoidance, and unfortunately I haven't been able to talk to that today because it's only come out very recently. But if you look on the Suffolk County Council website, I'm sure you'd find a link through the Psychology and Therapeutic Services page. You'll be able to see that new guidance, which will really add in and support, I think, that what we've been talking about today about what's most helpful for children and young people.
Yeah, thank you, Linda. And just to comment, someone's asked about making sure they get sent these things. So what we're hoping can be done is that for anyone that attended, we can send out the presentation and kind of any of those useful links as well, so that you can have that information accessible to you. Yes, we will try to do that. So hopefully it will all be there for you in your inbox soonish. So we'll stop there, and I'm sure you've all got other busy days and things to go to. So thank you for coming along. We do hope it was useful, and thanks for joining us.